Chandrika returns to her mother's courtyard on a shaded Mysore lane, carrying years of silence from her life in Singapore. She finds herself drawn to Indranil's corner coffee shop, where the scent of roasted beans and the rhythm of brass tumblers offer a quiet space to bridge the distance she has felt for so long. As slow conversations unfold under the rain trees and small offerings of Mysore pak are shared, the neighborhood's gentle rhythm begins to hold a place for her once more. Settle in for this warm, slow-blooming story of homecoming, where every shared silence feels like a blessing. The suitcase and the gate. The diesel fume hit her before the pavement did, a wet, throat-thick plume that smelled of burnt fuel and monsoon mud. Chandrika stepped off the KSRTC bus with one foot and felt the lane swallow the shadow of her suitcase before she had fully planted herself on the ground. The air-conditioned silence of the bus was gone, replaced by the low, cicada-dense hum of a Mysore afternoon that had been waiting, apparently, for exactly this moment. The heat pressed against her skin like a heavy hand, immediate and suffocating, stripping away the sterile coolness she'd carried from Singapore. She adjusted her grip on the suitcase handle, the plastic digging into her palm, and took a breath that tasted of dust and drying rain. She dragged the suitcase past the shuttered grocery shop, where the metal roller was pulled down tight against the afternoon heat, the padlock gleaming dully in the shade. A new bougainvillea vine had strangled the old iron gate of her mother's courtyard, magenta bracts choking the rusted bars until the entrance looked like a stranger's house. She stopped. The iron was the same, the rust was the same, but the violence of the vine made the familiar look foreign. For a second, a cold prickle ran down her spine. She wondered if she had the wrong address, if the life she remembered had been paved over by this aggressive bloom. She pushed the gate. It creaked with the exact rust note she remembered from age 12, a groan of metal that sounded like a complaint she had heard 1,000 times before. But the night bloom scent vine had climbed higher than she remembered, draping heavy white blossoms over the lintel like a welcome she hadn't expected. The flowers were thick, waxy, and open, releasing a sweetness that didn't ask permission. It demanded attention. She stood under them for a moment, the suitcase handle digging into her palm, and let the scent do what the gate could not, open her. It was an invasion of the senses, soft and overwhelming, bypassing every defense she'd built over the years. Her mother appeared in the doorway. She was not running. She was not crying. She stood with a brass tumbler in her hand, holding it at waist height, as if she had been waiting at exactly this spot since Chandrika left. The amber light from the interior caught the brass and threw a small, warm circle onto the veranda floor, illuminating the dust motes that danced in the disturbed air. Chandrika set the suitcase down inside the threshold. The wheels scraped against the stone, a harsh sound that broke the silence. Dust motes in the amber light swirled around her ankles, rising like the particles of a memory she was trying not to disturb. She did not speak. Her mother did not speak. The brass tumbler was enough. It was a language older than words, a signal that the wait was over. Chandrika walked to the kitchen and opened the window. The screen was stiff, the hinges protesting with a dry click, and then the scent of roasted coffee dust drifted in from somewhere down the lane. It was a smell, not just coffee, but coffee roasted on a slow flame, the kind that took 20 minutes and filled the street with a bitter, comforting smoke. Her hands stopped moving. They hung at her sides for 3 full seconds, fingers uncurled, palms open. The smell was a map. It told her exactly where she was, and for those 3 seconds, the years in Singapore collapsed into the space between the window frame and the street. The concrete towers and humid efficiency of her life abroad dissolved, replaced by the slow, deliberate rhythm of this single street. Her mother said, "The lane missed you." Chandrika didn't answer. The sentence felt too large to hold in one breath, too complete to fit into the small space between her ribs where the loneliness had been living. She studied the brass tumbler in her mother's hand, at the condensation beating on the metal, and understood that her mother had been standing there long enough for the coffee to cool. That was the answer. That was the welcome. It wasn't in the words, but in the stillness, in the refusal to move until the daughter returned. She went back to the gate and touched the night bloom scent vine again. This time she pressed a single bloom between her thumb and forefinger until the petals bruised, turning from white to a translucent brown at the edges. It was a small violence against something soft, a test to see if home was still real, if the flowers would yield under pressure the way memories did. They did. The bruise spread slowly, like a confession, and she let the damaged bloom hang from the vine, a mark of her return that only the lane would see. She needed to know that things here could still break, that this place wasn't a museum of a childhood she'd romanticized from afar. At the far end of the lane, Amara Okafor stood with her camera raised. She had been walking the lane for an hour, framing shots of the bougainvillea against the grey sky, when she saw the silhouette against the gate. She raised the lens, the viewfinder filling with Chandrika's profile, the suitcase, the bruised flower. Her finger hovered over the shutter button, ready to capture the raw geometry of return. Then she lowered the camera. She sensed that this moment belonged to the lane, not to film, and that pressing the shutter would be a theft. Some things were too heavy for a frame. They had to be lived, not captured. She tucked the camera under her arm and walked away, leaving the image undeveloped, respecting the privacy of a homecoming. Chandrika lay on the cot in her childhood room. The ceiling fan clicked with each rotation, a rhythmic metal-on-metal sound that she counted without meaning to. 1 click, 2 clicks, 3 clicks. The room smelled of dried neem leaves and old cotton, a scent that had seeped into the walls decades ago. She counted until sleep took her, not because she was tired, but because the rhythm matched something she had been missing for years. The click was a metronome for a song she had forgotten, a beat that her body recognized before her mind did. She slept with one hand on the brass tumbler her mother had left on the floor beside the cot, the metal cool against her skin. She dreamed of the percolator hissing in a room she couldn't see. The hiss was close, intimate, the sound of water meeting coffee grounds in a vessel she knew but couldn't place. She woke to the actual sound leaking through the open window from Indranil's coffee house 3 doors down. The hiss was real. The percolator was real. The lane was real. She lay still and listened to the final drip echo in the silence. A question she hadn't asked yet, whether the lane still had a space for someone who left. The drip came again. And again. Each one a small punctuation in the sentence of her return, waiting for an answer she wasn't ready to give. The fan clicked. The night bloom scent opened. The lane held its breath. The empty tumbler. The grinder's crank bit through the silence at 5047 a.m., a brass and steel resistance that traveled up Indranil's wrist before it ever reached his ear. He pressed the crank forward, then back, then forward again, feeling the beans crack inside the hopper like dry twigs snapping in a winter fire. The smell arrived first, sharp, green, unburnt, a promise of heat before the first grounds tumbled into the tin cup below. He knew the exact weight of the beans by the number of turns. 36 for the morning batch, 42 if Sundararajan was sitting on his veranda across the lane. Today it was 36. He counted without meaning to, the way one counts steps on a familiar staircase in the dark, fingers mapping the void by habit alone. The brass tumblers sat on the counter in a row, 5 of them, gleaming dully in the amber dawn light that filtered through the shop's single window. He polished each one with a cotton circle cut from an old lungi years ago, the fabric soft as a second skin. No streaks. No fingerprints. The brass had to look as though it had never been touched, even though it would be claimed within minutes. He wiped the first tumbler, then the second, then the third, and when he reached the 5th, his hand slowed. His thumb traced the rim, feeling for a nick or a dent, and when he found none, he set it down with deliberate care, aligning it perfectly with the others. He had set 5 tumblers every morning for 7 years. Not because 5 people came, 4 was the usual number, but because the 5th carried a history heavy enough to anchor the counter. Chandrika's father, Ramanathan Iyer, used to arrive at 6015 a.m., sharp, not a minute early, not a minute late. He would sit on the stool by the window, unfold his newspaper with a crisp rustle, and wait for Indranil to pour the kayapi without asking. The routine had lasted 12 years, from 1998 to 2010, until Ramanathan simply stopped coming. Indranil never asked why. The lane didn't ask why. It only noticed the absence and adjusted its rhythm around the hollow space. Now the 5th tumbler sat empty, a brass question mark on the counter. Indranil stared at it until the memory surfaced, unbidden. It was always there. The ritual demanded the space remain ready, even if no one filled it. To remove the tumbler would be to admit the silence was permanent, and Indranil wasn't ready to make that admission. Across the lane, Sundararajan sat cross-legged on his veranda, his white beard resting against his chest like a folded letter sealed with wax. He watched Indranil's hesitation through the gap in the bougainvillea hedge, his eyes narrow, his expression unchanged. Some silences were older than conversation. Sundararajan had learned that decades ago, sitting on this same veranda, watching the same lane wake up. He stroked his beard slowly, the gesture so practiced it looked like breathing, a rhythmic pulse that matched the turning of the grinder. He said nothing. He knew better than to speak into a grief that hadn't yet named itself. Indranil poured the first filter into the 5th tumbler anyway, not because he expected Ramanathan, not because he expected anyone, because the ritual demanded the space remain ready, and rituals were the only language the lane spoke fluently. The coffee hissed into the brass, a thin, silver stream that smelled of burnt caramel and wet earth. He set the tumbler down and watched the surface settle, the tiny bubbles forming and popping like a slow, interrupted conversation. Outside the shop window, Amara Okafor raised her camera. She had been walking the lane for an hour, framing shots of the bougainvillea against the gray dawn sky, when the brass tumblers caught her eye through the glass. She adjusted the focus ring, the viewfinder filling with the perfect geometry of 5 brass cylinders in a row. She pressed the shutter button, captured the image, then reviewed it on the screen. The 5th tumbler was empty. She could see the coffee stain at the bottom, the faint ring where the liquid had touched the brass and retreated. She zoomed in, framing the emptiness, and then she deleted the image before saving it. Some things weren't hers to keep. The privacy of a ritual didn't need documentation, it needed witness, and she had already been that. She lowered the camera, tucked it under her arm, and walked away, leaving the moment undeveloped, respecting the quiet sanctity of a grief she wasn't invited to share. The percolator began to hiss, a thin, silver sound that had marked this street's hours for 30 years. Indranil tilted his head, listening for a change in the rhythm. The hiss was steady, unwavering, the same pitch it had been yesterday and the day before. He had learned to read the percolator's moods. A sharp hiss meant the water was too hot. A low gurgle meant the grounds were packed too tight. Today it hissed evenly, a middle tone, neither urgent nor lazy. A good morning. Or at least, a morning that hadn't yet decided to break. He wiped the counter slowly, buying time. The cloth moved in one direction only, left to right, never back and forth. The lane had taught him that forward motion was the only honest kind. You couldn't undo a spill by wiping backward. You couldn't unring a bell. You could only move forward, absorb what happened, and keep wiping until the wood was dry again. A young boy from the next house ran past with a newspaper under his arm, his school bag bouncing against his hip like a loose drum. Indranil handed him a tumbler of kayapi without being asked, the brass warm against the boy's small fingers. The boy took it, drank standing up, already late for school, his throat working quickly against the bitterness, and vanished around the corner. Indranil watched him go, not for the first time thinking that the neighborhood's rhythm was a language he spoke fluently but no longer wrote. He understood the grammar of the street, the sweep of the broom, the ring of the bell, the rush of the boy, but he felt like a reader who had forgotten how to hold the pen. The lane was waking up. A woman swept her doorstep with a coconut broom, the bristles scratching the stone in a rhythmic rasp. A temple bell rang 3 times, the sound carrying through the humid air like a golden thread, stitching the morning together. Somewhere a radio played a Carnatic raga, the notes winding through the street in a pattern that sounded exactly like coffee percolating, steady, circular, inevitable. Indranil turned the empty 5th tumbler upside down on the counter, a small, private gesture. The brass ringed once against the wood, a clear, lonely note, before settling into silence. He closed his eyes for one breath, inhaling the scent of grounds and damp stone, and opened them to the street stirring around him. The woman sweeping, the bell ringing, the radio playing, and the empty tumbler still waiting, not for a person, but for the possibility of return. The possibility was enough. The scent of roasted dust. The dawn air hung thick and cool against Chandrika's skin as she stepped through her mother's gate, the brass latch clicking shut behind her with a sound that felt too loud for the sleeping lane. She had dressed without thinking, pulling on the cotton sari her mother had worn during the long, slow winters of her illness. The fabric was stiff, holding the sharp, medicinal scent of camphor and the deeper, quieter smell of stored linen, of drawers left undisturbed, of time folded away between layers of cloth. It was an armor of memory, and she wore it without questioning why. Her feet found the dust of the lane before her mind registered the ground, barefoot, as always in the early hours. The earth here was not merely dirt. It was a packed, fine powder that rose to meet her soles like a greeting, warm even in the morning chill, familiar as a heartbeat. She carried the milk pail by its wire handle, the aluminum cool against her palm, swinging slightly with the rhythm of her walk. She passed the flower shop first, its metal shutter drawn tight, the faint perfume of night bloom scent trapped behind the iron like a secret waiting to be told. Next came the tailor's stall, the sewing machine silent under a dust sheet, a pair of scissors visible through the gap in the cloth like a closed eye. The lane was a corridor of suspended lives, every shutter a paused breath. Then the scent hit her. It rose from Indranil's corner, not as a waft, but as an assertion. A dark, sweet column of roasted coffee dust that cut through the camphor and the dust and the nightbloom scent, demanding recognition. It was heavy and granular, smelling of earth that had been burned and blessed, of beans crushed and coaxed into something far greater than their sum. It rose like a hand reaching out, fingers of aroma curling around her wrist, pulling her to a halt mid-stride. Chandrika stopped. The milk pail swung forward, then back, the liquid inside sloshing softly. She stood at the threshold of the coffee house, one foot on the packed earth of the lane, the other hovering just above the worn stone of the shop's entry. The space between felt vast. Was this place only for those who had never left? For those whose roots had never been severed? The thought tightened her chest, a familiar constriction she had spent years learning to ignore. Inside, Indranil looked up from behind the brass counter. He had been polishing a glass, the cloth moving in slow, practiced circles. He did not call out. He did not gesture, did not nod, did not offer the performative welcome of a shopkeeper. He simply smiled. It began in his eyes, a crinkling, knowing warmth that predated the movement of his lips, and then his mouth followed, curving into the same expression that had greeted her father every morning for 30 years. The smile held no question, no surprise at her presence, only a quiet acknowledgement that she had arrived exactly when she was meant to. He knew, Chandrika thought, the realization settling over her like the camphor-scented sari. He knew I would come. She crossed the threshold. The world narrowed instantly. The amber glow of the single hanging bulb washed over everything, turning the brass counter into a river of gold and the rows of tumblers into a choir of polished metal. The air inside was dense, humid with steam, and the low, resonant hum of coffee being poured. She heard the liquid hitting the bottom of a tumbler that, moments ago, had been empty, a sound like rain on a tin roof, rhythmic and inevitable. Across the lane, Amara stood on her veranda step, a cup of tea cooling in her own hand. She raised her fingers, framing the scene in the coffee-house doorway, the woman in the camphor sari, the man behind the brass, the amber light spilling out onto the dust. She did not raise her camera. The moment felt too intimate for a lens, too fragile for the click of a shutter. Some things were meant to be witnessed, not captured. Indranil pushed the tumbler toward Chandrika. He did not ask what she wanted. He did not need to. The kaapi was already the right temperature. The froth settled into a perfect stillness that spoke of long practice and longer patience. The brass was warm beneath her fingertips as she wrapped her hands around it, and she did not drink. Not yet. For a full minute, she simply held the vessel. The heat traveled up her wrists, seeping past the skin and the bone, finding the quiet place behind her sternum that had been cold for years. It was a coldness she had mistaken for strength, a numbness she had called resilience. Now, under the gentle assault of the warmth, she felt it begin to thaw, and the sensation was so overwhelming she had to look down at the counter to keep her composure. "The copy remembers who it's for," Sundararajan called from his veranda, his voice dry and cracked like the old teak rail he leaned against. Chandrika laughed. It was a soft, surprised sound, escaping her before she could cage it. It startled even her, a bird taking flight from a branch she hadn't realized she was perched on. She looked toward Sundararajan, then back at Indranil, and saw the smile deepen, the corners of his eyes gathering the laughter she had just released. She lifted the tumbler and drank slowly. The first sip was chicory and decades. It was bitter and sweet, earthy and sharp, a flavor that carried the weight of mornings long past and the promise of mornings yet to come. Each sip was a sentence she hadn't known she needed to hear, a language spoken in the tongue of roasted beans and boiling milk, telling her that she was known, that she was expected, that she was home. When she set the tumbler down, the brass clicked softly against the counter. Indranil reached for a cloth and wiped the surface once, a single, smooth pass. The counter was not dirty. The gesture was not about cleanliness. It was a punctuation mark, a period at the end of a long, unspoken sentence. "You are here now," the motion said, "and that is enough." Chandrika picked up her milk pail, now empty, the aluminum light in her hand. She walked back toward her mother's gate, the dust rising again to meet her bare feet. As she passed the trellis near the lane's bend, the night bloom scent vine brushed her shoulder, its white flowers opening to the dim light. The stems snagged briefly on the cotton of her sari, a gentle tether, before releasing her. She did not flinch. Behind her, in the coffee house, the fifth tumbler sat on the counter, its base already ringed with moisture, waiting for the next hand to find it warm. The froth and the pause. The brass tumbler was still warm when Chandrika reached for it the next morning, and that warmth traveled up through her fingers to settle somewhere behind her sternum, exactly where the cold had lived for years. It was a kind of heat, radiating from the metal like a slow confession. She hadn't come for milk today. The milk pail sat at home on the counter, unused, its aluminum surface already dulling in the morning light, and the walk to Indranil's corner had nothing to do with errands. It had everything to do with the ache in her hands, a hollow pull that only the coffee seemed able to fill, a gravity that drew her bare feet down the lane before her mind had fully decided to move. Indranil was already there, of course. He had been there before dawn, grinding beans with the same slow, deliberate rotation he once used to wind a pocket watch, the crank handle worn smooth by decades of turning. The percolator hissed like a kettle settling into a long, resigned sigh, steam curling into the pale blue of the early sky. He watched the froth settle into perfect stillness, that thin, pale cap of bubbles trembling on the dark surface, signaling the coffee was ready to speak. He lifted the tumbler and set it before Chandrika without a word, placing it with the reverence of a priest setting down a chalice, his fingers careful not to clatter against the brass. She wrapped both hands around the vessel and inhaled. Chicory and roasted beans, milk boiled until it thickened into something almost solid, and beneath it all, the ghost of night bloom scent drifting from somewhere up the lane. Singapore had never smelled like this. Singapore smelled of rain that fell in straight industrial lines, hammering against glass towers, of MRT trains that breathed too loudly, exhaling hot, recycled air into crowded platforms, of humidity that pressed against the skin like a wet wool cloth, suffocating and relentless. She said as much, her voice soft and measured, the words trailing off into the comfortable silence that had always lived between them, a silence that felt less like absence and more like a held breath. "The rain there," she said, looking down at the froth as if reading a map in the bubbles. "It doesn't smell like earth, it smells like concrete, like wet cement that never dries." Indranil tilted his head, the motion small and precise. He wanted to ask about her father. He wanted to know if Singapore held the night bloom scent too, or if the loneliness she carried in her posture was the same loneliness that lived in this lane, aged and settled like dust. But his role had always been the listener, and he remembered it like a muscle memory, a reflex polished over decades until it was seamless. He wiped the counter once, a single smooth pass of the damp cloth, and said nothing, though the questions burned behind his teeth. From the veranda, Sundararajan leaned on his walking stick, the wood dark and polished from years of gripping. His white beard caught the pale morning light, glowing like spun sugar against the shadowed teak of the pillar behind him. He didn't look at anyone when he spoke, his gaze fixed on the cracked earth of the courtyard, his voice dry and textured like the old rail he leaned against. "Your father used to say Singapore was where the coffee forgot how to taste like home." Chandrika's hands paused around the tumbler, her fingers freezing mid-stroke against the warm metal. She studied Sundararajan and saw not an old man, but a keeper of stories she hadn't known existed. Her father had spoken to Sundararajan about Singapore? Her father, who had rarely spoken about anything at all. A man who communicated in glances and the placement of objects. The revelation sat in her chest like a stone dropped into still water, rippling outward in circles she hadn't expected, disturbing layers of sediment she thought undisturbed. Indranil wiped the counter again, slower this time, the cloth dragging as if weighted. He was buying time. He realized that for the first time in decades he wanted to offer more than just a drink. He wanted to offer the silence that held the drink, the silence that made the coffee possible. He wanted to say something, anything, to bridge the gap that Sundararajan's words had just widened. But the words sat heavy on his tongue, unfamiliar and clumsy after years of practiced withholding. Chandrika spoke again, her voice dropping lower, trailing into that comfortable silence that was becoming a language of its own. "No one there knows my mother's name," she said, the admission falling from her lips like something she had been carrying too long. "Not one person. In 10 years, not one person has asked." The loneliness of a city where no one knows your mother's name. The words hung in the air between them, fragile and devastatingly true. Indranil didn't fill the silence. He let it breathe, let it do its work, the way he let the coffee percolate until it was ready, trusting that the steeping was as important as the pour. Amara stood at the lane's edge, her camera raised to her eye. She framed the scene with her fingers, capturing the steam rising from the calliope in a thin, pale ribbon that twisted against the morning gray. The shutter clicked softly, catching the exact moment the froth broke, the bubbles collapsing into the dark liquid beneath in a miniature implosion. She didn't show it to anyone. Some moments were too tender to share, too private to frame, belonging only to the silence that birthed them. Indranil noticed Chandrika's left hand tracing the rim of the tumbler, her index finger moving in a slow, unconscious circle, the nail catching the light. He remembered this habit from her childhood, when she would trace the rim while waiting for her father to finish his coffee, her eyes fixed on the brass until the last drop was gone, afraid to look away in case the moment ended too soon. He said nothing about it. Some recognitions were too tender to name, too fragile to acknowledge aloud without shattering them. The percolator hissed once, sharply, as if punctuating a sentence no one had spoken. The sound cut through the quiet like a needle through cloth, precise and deliberate, drawing everyone's attention back to the present. Sundararajan stirred on his veranda, stroking his beard thoughtfully, his gaze fixed on some middle distance that held more stories than anyone could ever tell. Chandrika finished her coffee and set the tumbler down. She didn't say thank you. The gratitude was in the way she left the tumbler on the counter, exactly where Indranil could reach it, her fingers lingering for a heartbeat on the warm brass before she stood. She walked back toward her mother's gate, barefoot, the dust rising to meet her feet like a greeting. As she passed the trellis near the lane's bend, the night bloom scent vine brushed her shoulder again, its white flowers opening to the dim light, releasing a perfume that was heavy and sweet and entirely terrestrial. She didn't flinch this time either. Indranil watched her walk away, the cotton of her sari catching briefly on the night bloom scent stems before releasing her, the fabric whispering against the leaves. He wiped the counter once more, the cloth moving in slow, endless circles, and wondered, for the first time in decades, whether listening was enough. The fifth tumbler sat on the counter, its base already ringed with moisture, waiting. He studied it and then looked away, his hands still moving, still polishing, still waiting. The percolator hissed again, softer this time, a question without an answer, hanging in the air long after the steam had faded. The rain tree stool. The rain trees were shedding again, slow spirals of green that drifted down like thoughts too heavy to hold. They landed on Indranil's dhoti without him brushing them off, accumulating in soft, damp clusters against the white cotton. He sat on the low stool outside his shop, watching the pattern with the patience of a person who had all the time in the world and no reason to spend it differently. The stool beside him was empty, its wood warm from the day's sun, radiating a dried, baked heat that seemed to pulse against the cooling air. It sat there as if it had been waiting for a weight, a warmth, and had been waiting long enough to forget it was waiting at all. Chandrika appeared at the lane's bend, her mother's camphor-scented sari catching the last bruised purple of the evening light. She saw him there, saw the empty stool, and something in her chest loosened, not dramatically, not all at once, but the way a knot unties itself when you stop pulling and just let gravity do the work. She hesitated only a moment, aware of the dust on her sandals and the distance she had traveled, before stepping onto the packed earth of the lane. He gestured without speaking, a tilt of his head, a glance at the stool. No invitation could have been quieter or more absolute. She sat. The wood was warm, almost hot, and for a moment she felt the day's accumulated heat seep into her thighs, a small invasion that felt like welcome rather than trespass. She started to say something about Singapore. The skyline, the glass towers, the way the rain fell in straight, relentless lines, and stopped. The words formed on her tongue, sharp and modern, but the rain tree shadows didn't care about skylines. The shadows cared about the slow spiral of leaves, the warm wood, the silence that wasn't empty but full of things unsaid. She swallowed the sentence whole, letting it dissolve before it could offend the stillness. "Does it rain differently there?" Indranil asked. His voice was low, unhurried, the kind of voice that made you want to answer carefully, the kind that made you realize the question wasn't about weather. He was asking whether the rain felt different when she was alone. He was asking whether she had ever stood at a window and watched the rain and felt it, really felt it, or whether she had just watched it and moved on. She told him. She told him about the rain in Singapore, how it fell in straight, relentless lines, how it sounded like 1,000 fingers tapping on glass, how it never seemed to stop, how it never seemed to start, how it was always just there, a constant, indifferent presence. She told him how she had stood at her window sometimes late at night and watched the rain and felt nothing, and how that nothing had frightened her more than any storm. He listened without interrupting. He tilted his head slightly, the way he did when he was listening, and his eyes were on the rain trees, not on her, which somehow made it easier to speak. The absence of his gaze felt like a door left open, an allowance for her to say the things that usually stayed locked behind her ribs. Across the lane, Hana Tanaka tended her night bloom scent garden next to Chandrika's mother's courtyard. She moved among the plants with a reverence that suggested she understood some things required care without expectation of return. The evening air thickened with the heavy, sweet perfume of the blooms, a scent that smelled of moonlight and old secrets. She cut a small cluster of night bloom scent flowers, white and heady with perfume, and carried them to Chandrika's gate. She arranged them in a circle that looked accidental but wasn't, each bloom placed with the precision of a person who understood that beauty required intention even when it pretended otherwise. Chandrika noticed the night bloom scent at her gate later, when she stood to leave. The fragrance hit her first, a sudden cloying wave that anchored her to the spot. She picked up one bloom and pressed it into her sari fold, not thinking about why, not thinking about anything, just pressing the flower into the fabric and feeling its weight, its perfume, its small, quiet insistence on being noticed. It was a secret she would carry without knowing she carried it. The streetlights flickered on with a faint buzz, casting long, distorted shadows across the lane. Their voices blended with the soft rustle of rain tree leaves, and the conversation became less about words and more about the rhythm of speaking and listening. It was the way two people could sit together and say nothing, and still say everything, the pauses holding more weight than the syllables. Amara walked past without her camera. She framed the scene with her fingers one last time, a reflex, a habit, a way of seeing the world as a series of compositions, and then she let her hands fall to her sides. She chose to witness without capturing. Some moments were too tender for frames. To trap them in a rectangle would be to break them. Indranil told Chandrika that the rain trees were planted the year she was born. He said it simply, without ceremony, the way you might mention that the shop had always sold coffee, or that the lane had always smelled of night bloom scent. She looked up at the canopy and saw not a tree but a timeline, not leaves but years, not branches, but the slow accumulation of days that had led to this. Evening, this stool, this silence. The leaves above her were older than her memories, their roots tangled in a history she had tried to outrun. They sat until the stars began to emerge, faint at first, then bright enough to count, but neither of them counted because some things aren't meant to be numbered. The stars were there, the rain trees were there, the warm wood was there, and the silence was full. When Chandrika stood to leave, Indranil didn't watch her go. He watched the last leaf fall from the rain tree, slow and deliberate, a spiral that ended on the ground without fanfare. The falling was the same whether anyone saw it or not. The falling was the point. Plus, the rusty story. Indranil cleared his throat, and the sound startled him, not because it was loud, but because it was his. 3 times he tried, each attempt feeling like opening a door in a room he'd forgotten existed. Chandrika sat on the stool across from him, her hands wrapped around the brass tumbler he'd filled 20 minutes ago. The coffee had cooled to a comfortable warmth, the kind that seeped into palms and stayed. She hadn't spoken since sitting down, hadn't needed to. The silence between them had always been enough. But tonight, something had shifted. Indranil could feel it pressing against his ribs, a small insistence that had been building for weeks. He'd spent 30 years listening to other people's stories. The old men who came at dawn with their complaints about sons, the young women who whispered about husbands, the children who babbled about school. He'd held space for all of them, wiped counters, poured coffee, nodded at the right moments. But he'd never offered one of his own. "There was something I wanted to tell you," he said, and his voice sounded foreign to his own ears. It was lower than he remembered, rougher, as if the words had been sitting in his throat so long they'd grown calloused. Chandrika looked up, not with expectation or impatience, but with the same gentle attention he'd always given her. The kind of looking that said, "I'm here. Take your time." He cleared his throat again. The 3rd time, the sound felt less foreign. Maybe it was just practice. Maybe it was something else. "When I was 22, he began, "Sundararajan let me touch the percolator." He paused. The words hung in the air between them, simple and strange. He hadn't told this story in decades. Not because it was secret exactly, but because he'd never thought anyone would want to hear it. He was the listener, the one who poured coffee and nodded, the one whose stories didn't matter. He made me percolate water through the filter 40 times. 40, before he let me taste what I'd made. Indranil smiled, and it felt unfamiliar on his face. I thought he was cruel. I was angry. I wanted to throw the filter at the wall. Chandrika's fingers traced the rim of her tumbler. She wasn't interrupting. She wasn't filling the silence with nervous chatter or encouraging noises. She was just listening, the way he'd spent years teaching himself to listen to others. After the 40th time, he let me drink. And it was perfect. Better than perfect. It was the first thing I'd ever made that tasted like something I understood. His voice cracked on the last word, and he looked down at the counter. He wiped it once, not because it needed cleaning, the brass was already polished to a soft gleam, but because the gesture had become his language. When words failed, his hands spoke. Across the lane, Amara raised her camera. She'd been walking home, her bag slung over one shoulder, when she heard Indranil's voice. It was different tonight, rougher, unsteady. She stopped and leaned against the wall, framing the scene with her camera. Indranil bent over his counter, Chandrika watching him with that quiet intensity, the brass tumblers catching the last of the evening light. She pressed the shutter button halfway, felt the resistance, and then lowered the camera. Not because the moment wasn't worth capturing, because it was too precious. Some scenes belonged to the people in them, not to the lens. She slipped the camera back into her bag and stood there in the gathering dark, watching without recording. On his veranda, Sundararajan sat cross-legged, stroking his white beard. He'd heard Indranil's voice too, carried on the warm air like smoke from a distant fire. He didn't smile or nod or react at all. He just listened, because he knew the story wasn't about accuracy. It wasn't about whether he'd actually made Indranil percolate 40 times, or 30, or 50. It was about the first time someone trusted you with a secret. The secret that you could make something beautiful, that your hands knew something your mind hadn't yet learned. Indranil finished speaking. The silence that followed wasn't empty. It was full, like the pause between notes in a slow raga, the space where the music lives. He waited for Chandrika to say something, anything. A question, a comment, a laugh. He braced himself for the moment when she'd realize his story was awkward and unimportant, when she'd understand that he wasn't a storyteller and never would be. "You kept the secret of the 40 percolations all these years," she said. And just like that, his fear dissolved. She wasn't asking why he'd kept it. She wasn't judging him for waiting so long to share it. She was simply witnessing, the way a rain tree witnesses the falling of its own leaves, without comment, without expectation. Hearing was its own kind of answer. He wiped the counter again. The brass was already clean, but his hands needed the motion. It was their language now, the three of them sitting in the warm lamplight, saying everything without saying anything. The percolator hissed once, softly, as if acknowledging the story's end. Indranil hadn't been brewing anything, there was no coffee being made. But the sound came anyway, a small mechanical sigh that seemed to understand what had just happened. He closed his eyes for one breath. In that darkness behind his eyelids, he realized something. Sharing didn't diminish his role as a listener. It deepened it, because now he knew what silence cost. Now he understood the weight of the space between words, the courage it took to fill it. Amara put her camera in her bag and walked home without taking a single photograph that evening. The Lane story didn't need her lens to exist. Some things were already whole, already complete, already enough. She walked past the night bloom scent garden where Hana Tanaka sat very still among the white blooms, arranging nothing, touching the plants reverently as if they might speak. Amara nodded to her, and Hana nodded back, and neither of them said a word. They didn't need to. Indranil opened his eyes. Chandrika was still watching him, still wrapped around her cooling coffee, still present in a way that had nothing to do with performance and everything to do with being. He smiled, this time with his mouth as well as his eyes, and picked up the cloth to wipe the counter one more time. Not because it needed cleaning, because the gesture had become their language. The Mysore pot gift. Chandrika held the tin against her hip bone, her fingers pressing into the dented sides until the metal warmed with the heat of her palm. The tin was small, barely enough for 4 pieces of Mysore pak, and she had wrapped it in yesterday's newspaper, folding the edges with care even though the paper was already creased and yellowed. She stood at the edge of Indranil's stall, watching him wipe the brass tumblers with a cloth that had seen better days, and she felt the weight of the tin as if it were something enormous, something that carried all the unspoken gratitude of the past weeks, the filter coffee served without words, the silence that held space for her mother's absence, the way he had never asked why she returned alone. She stepped forward, the gravel crunching beneath her bare feet, and placed the tin on the counter. The sound was small, almost apologetic, and she immediately regretted the offering. It was too little, too simple, a tin of sweet from her mother's kitchen that she had found in the back of the cupboard, wrapped in cloth that smelled faintly of camphor and night bloom scent. What was Mysore pak to a man who understood the architecture of silence? What was a small tin of ghee-laden sweetness compared to the quiet companionship he had given her every morning since she returned? Indranil stopped wiping. He studied the tin, then at her, and his head tilted slightly, the way it always did when he was listening to something deeper than words. He reached out and picked up the tin as if it were a rare artifact, turning it slowly in his hands, his thumb tracing the dents in the metal. Chandrika watched his face, bracing herself for the moment when he would see the smallness of her gift, when he would understand that she had nothing grand to offer, no elaborate ritual or precious memory, just a tin of sweet that her mother had probably made decades ago, before Chandrika left for Singapore, before the years of coldness settled in her bones. But his smile came slowly, reaching his eyes before his mouth, the way dawn arrives in Mysore, first a lightening at the edges, then a warmth that fills everything. He set the tin down and opened it with deliberate care, peeling back the newspaper wrapping, lifting the lid that stuck slightly at the edges. Inside, the Mysore pak was golden and dense, cut into perfect squares that gleamed with the sheen of ghee and sugar. The scent rose immediately, sweet and rich, carrying the warmth of melted ghee and the crystalline promise of sugar syrup, and it filled the small space between them like a prayer offered without words. Chandrika held her breath, watching his expression shift from curiosity to something softer, something that looked like recognition. He broke one square in half with careful fingers, the pieces separating cleanly along the line where the knife had cut, and he offered her the larger piece on his open palm. She took it without speaking, her fingers brushing his, and they ate in the comfortable silence that had become their language. The Mysore pak dissolved on her tongue, sweet and dense, the ghee melting into warmth that spread to her chest, and crumbs fell onto the brass tray below, small golden fragments that scattered like coins. From his veranda across the lane, Sundararajan watched them with the satisfaction of a man who has waited a lifetime to see something take root. He stroked his white beard thoughtfully, his eyes crinkling at the corners, and he knew that the traditions he had cherished, the slow percolation of coffee, the offering of food without expectation, the silence that held more than words, were alive in the next generation. Not because they were preserved perfectly, not because Chandrika's Mysore pak was flawless or Indranil's coffee was brewed by ancient rules, but because they were shared imperfectly, offered with the vulnerability of hands that tremble slightly when giving something precious. Amara stood outside the lane, her camera raised, and she photographed the empty tin after they had finished. The light was golden and low, hitting the brass interior at an angle that made the metal glow, and she captured the way the tin sat on the counter, its purpose fulfilled, its emptiness a testament to something consumed and shared. But she did not show the image to anyone. Some gifts were not meant to be documented. Some moments existed only in the space between people, and the photograph would flatten something that was meant to remain three-dimensional, alive in the memory of taste and touch. Chandrika brushed the crumbs from the brass tray with her fingers, gathering the small golden fragments into her palm, and Indranil did not stop her. The ritual of cleaning up was part of the nourishment, the way wiping the counter had become their language, the way silence had become a form of speech. She told him about her mother's recipe then, the words coming slowly, measured by the pauses that had always defined her speech. "The ghee must be melted 3 times, she said, her voice soft, trailing off into the comfortable quiet between sentences. "The sugar syrup must be tested with a drop of water. If it forms a thread, it's ready. If it dissolves, you wait." Indranil listened as if she were reciting a sacred text, his eyes fixed on her face, his head tilted in that particular way that made her feel heard rather than merely listened to. She described the way her mother would stand over the stove, stirring the mixture with a wooden spoon, the way the kitchen would fill with the scent of ghee and sugar, the way Chandrika would sit on the floor nearby, watching the process with the absorption of a child who understands that love is made, not bought. When the tin was empty, when the last crumb had been brushed away and the newspaper wrapping folded neatly, Indranil placed the tin back on the counter. But he did not invert it, did not turn it upside down as one might with a finished vessel. He placed it on its side, a small gesture that carried its own grammar. This isn't finished, it's just resting. The tin waited, ready to be filled again, ready to hold whatever Chandrika might bring next time. Another recipe, another memory, another small offering that carried the weight of gratitude without the burden of explanation. Chandrika stood to leave, and she did not say thank you. The gratitude was in the way she left the tin, exactly where he could reach it, exactly where it had been placed when she arrived. The ritual did not require words, the offering was the language, and the acceptance was the reply. She walked away down the lane, her bare feet making no sound on the gravel, and she did not look back. Behind her, Indranil watched her go, and he realized that the stake had shifted. It was no longer about connection, no longer about building a bridge between two people who had spent years in silence. It was about the quiet joy of giving and receiving in equal measure. The way Mysore pak dissolved on the tongue, the way ghee melted into warmth, the way a small tin could hold all the unspoken things that two people had carried for years without knowing how to offer them. The ghee remembers the fire, Sundararajan called from his veranda, his voice carrying across the lane with the slow cadence of a man who speaks in proverbs. But the sweetness is what we choose to keep. The first star. Indranil turned the key in the brass shutter lock, and the metal-sharp click echoed down the lane like a period at the end of a long sentence. He did not hurry. The oil lamp on his counter burned low, casting shadows that stretched across the floor like fingers reaching for something they could not quite grasp. He wiped the brass tumblers one last time, his movements slow and deliberate, as if each stroke were a prayer. Then he stepped outside and locked the door, the sound sharp and final in the quiet evening. The lane was empty. The rain trees stood like sentinels along the street, their branches spreading wide against the darkening sky. Indranil walked to the low stone bench beneath the largest tree and sat, his back against the rough bark. He did not need to speak. The silence was enough. It had always been enough. Chandrika appeared at the edge of the lane, her bare feet making no sound on the gravel. She carried nothing in her hands, no tin, no recipe card, no offering. She simply walked to the bench and sat beside him, leaving a small space between them. The space was not empty. It was filled with everything they had said and everything they had not said over the weeks. The ghee remembered the fire, Sundararajan had said. But the sweetness was what they chose to keep. They sat in silence. The stars began to emerge, one by one, pale pinpricks against the indigo sky. Chandrika watched them appear, her hands resting in her lap, her fingers tracing the hem of her mother's camphor-scented sari. Indranil watched them too, his head tilted slightly, his eyes soft. There was nothing left to say. Every story had been told. Every silence had been shared. The vast quiet of the night stretched around them like a blanket, warm and complete. Amara came without her camera. She walked down the lane with her hands empty, her camera strap hanging loosely at her side. She sat on the low stool beside the bench and watched the stars emerge, feeling the peace of the moment without the need to record it. For years she had framed scenes with her fingers, capturing light and shadow in perfect composition. Tonight she let the moment exist without a lens. She leaned back against the rain tree, the rough bark pressing against her spine, and she realized she had been holding her camera strap like a lifeline for years. Tonight she let it fall. Sundararajan sat on his veranda step, his white beard catching the last of the lamplight. He stroked it thoughtfully, his eyes distant. Then he began to speak, his voice slow and warm, like turning the pages of an old book. The rain trees were planted by a British officer, he said, his cadence measured, each word placed with care. He fell in love with a night bloom scent seller's daughter. She sold night bloom scent and mogra in the market, and he bought flowers every morning, not because he needed them, but because he needed to see her. He paused, and the silence that followed felt like a blessing. No one applauded. Some stories were not meant to end with noise. He planted the trees so she would have shade when she walked to the market, Sundararajan continued. She never knew why the trees were there, she only knew that the walk was cooler, and the flowers bloomed brighter beneath their branches. Indranil listened, his eyes fixed on the old man's face. Chandrika listened too, her hands still. Amara listened, her camera forgotten on the ground beside her. The story hung in the air like the scent of night bloom scent, invisible and essential. Hana Tanaka tended her night bloom scent garden in the dark. She could not see the flowers, but she knew they were blooming by the scent. She arranged the stones in her Zen garden by touch alone, her fingers tracing the smooth surfaces, placing each one with precision. The stones were cool against her skin, and she sat very still when listening, her body a vessel for the quiet. She watched from her garden, though she could not see Chandrika clearly in the dark. She knew the night bloom scent vine by the gate was blooming, and that was enough. The peace of having created something lasting settled over her like a veil, soft and complete. The first star appeared. Chandrika and Indranil both watched it without speaking, their presence enough. The star was pale and distant, but it burned steady, a fixed point in the vast dark. Chandrika felt something shift inside her, not dramatic, not sudden, but quiet and sure. The loneliness she had carried from Singapore, the coldness that had settled in her bones during years of hotels and airports was thawing. Not all at once, but slowly, like ice melting in warm water. Amara leaned back against the rain tree, her eyes closed. She thought of all the moments she had captured and never lived in. The photographs were beautiful, but they were not this. This was the moment itself, unframed, uncomposed, existing only in the breath and the scent and the starlight. She let the camera strap fall from her fingers, and it lay on the ground beside her, a small surrender. Sundararajan finished his story and returned to his veranda. He sat cross-legged and stroked his beard, content that the traditions continued in the next generation's silence. The coffee remembered its people, he had said once, and the people remembered the coffee. The cycle was complete, for now. Indranil extinguished the oil lamp on his counter. The flame died with a soft sigh, and the lane was lit only by starlight and the distant temple bell. The sound of the bell traveled through the night, clear and resonant, marking the hour without urgency. Chandrika walked home through the sleeping lane. The cool earth beneath her bare feet felt like a promise. The night bloom scent trailed behind her like a veil she did not want to lose. She walked slowly, savoring each step, each breath. The lane was hers again, not in the way it had been when she was a child, but in a new way, quieter and deeper. The rituals were anchors, and she was held. She reached her mother's courtyard and stood at the gate. The night bloom scent flowers were blooming in the dark, their scent rising like a prayer. She touched them absently, her fingers tracing the petals, and she felt the years of coldness dissolve completely. She was home. Not because she had returned, but because she had stayed long enough to remember what home felt like. The Jasmine Vine. The lane had gone quiet, the kind of quiet that only exists between 11 and dawn in an Agrahara, when even the stray cats have settled into the hollows beneath parked scooters. Chandrika walked barefoot, one step, then another, the cool earth pressing up through her soles like a hand she hadn't realized was waiting. The night bloom scent trailing along the compound walls had opened fully now, its scent thick enough to taste, sweet and green and slightly bitter, the way strong coffee tastes when you let it sit too long. It followed her the way a veil might, drifting behind her shoulders, clinging to the damp cotton of her sarai. She didn't hurry. There was nowhere to hurry to, and the thought of hurrying felt like a betrayal of everything the evening had given her. She reached her mother's gate and stopped. Not because she was tired, not because the lane had ended, but because crossing the threshold meant leaving the warmth behind, even for sleep. The iron gate was cool under her palm, the paint peeling in long strips where the monsoon had worked at it over the years. Beyond it, the courtyard lay in shadow, the tulsi plant a dark lump against the wall, the cot on the veranda, a pale rectangle in the amber spill of the street lamp. Inside would be familiar, the brass tumblers stacked in the kitchen, the calendar with its curling corners, the smell of old wood and camphor. But out here, on the lane, the air still carried Indranil's coffee dust, still held Sundararajan's voice, still hummed with the low electricity of people who had chosen, however quietly, to be near one another. Going inside felt like closing a book she wasn't ready to put down. Her fingers found the night bloom vine by the gatepost, the stems cool and supple, the blossoms soft as skin. She touched one gently, then another, tracing the curve of a petal with her thumb. The scent wrapped around her wrists, her forearms, rising like a lullaby she'd been waiting years to hear. Not the one her mother had hummed, not the one from any particular memory, but something older and simpler, something that belonged to the plant itself and to the hour it had chosen to open. She stood there a long time, eyes closed, breathing it in, feeling the coldness that had lived in her bones since Singapore loosened another degree. Not gone yet, but loosening. From her garden next door, Hana watched. She couldn't see Chandrika clearly in the dark, just the shape of a woman at a gate, the suggestion of a hand on a vine. But she knew what the night bloom scent was doing. She'd tended it for 3 years now, watering it at dusk, pruning it with the small silver shears her grandmother had left her in Kyoto, watching it climb the gatepost and spill over the wall. It had been hers alone, a quiet project, something to do with her hands when the restlessness of moving between cities settled in her chest like a stone. But tonight, watching Chandrika touch the blossoms, Hana understood that the vine had become something else. It was no longer just hers. It was a bridge, small and fragrant and living, between Chandrika and the community that had gathered around her without anyone quite deciding to. Hana smiled, just barely, and went back to her own veranda, leaving the garden to its work. Chandrika pushed the gate open and stepped into the courtyard. The dust motes in the amber light swirled around her, tiny particles caught in the stillness, rising and falling like the fragments of a memory she was finally ready to unpack. She set the milk pail down on the veranda step, the metal ringing softly against the stone, and walked into the house. The rooms were cool, the tiles underfoot smooth and familiar. She didn't turn on the ceiling fan. She didn't need to. The air moved on its own here, slipping through the open windows, carrying the scent of night bloom scent and old wood and the faint, sweet decay of the tulsi plant's fallen leaves. She lay on the cot in her childhood room, the thin mattress creaking softly under her weight. The ceiling fan was off, but the room had its own rhythm. The click of the latch on the window, the creak of the wooden shutter as the breeze pushed it, the distant hum of a refrigerator 3 houses down. She counted the clicks, 1, 2, 3, not because she was tired, but because the rhythm matched something she'd been missing for years. A cadence, a pattern, the sound of a life that moved slowly enough to be counted. She slept and dreamed of a percolator hissing in a room she couldn't see. The dream had no shape, no faces, just the sound, steam and water and the low, persistent gurgle of coffee being made. When she woke, the sound was still there, leaking through the open window from Indranil's coffee house 3 doors down. It was before dawn, the sky still dark, but Indranil was already at work, grinding beans, heating milk, preparing for the first customers who would arrive with the sun. The hiss was steady, unhurried, the same sound she'd heard in Singapore hotel lobbies and airport cafes. But here it didn't sound like a question. It sounded like an answer. She lay still, listening. The final drip of the percolator echoed in the quiet, a single note hanging in the air before fading. Home was a state she carried, not a place she visited. The thought arrived without effort, without drama, simply settling into her chest like something that had always been true and was only now ready to be acknowledged. She rose and walked back to the gate. The night bloom vine was still there, still blooming, still scenting the air. She touched it one more time, her fingers pressing gently into the blossoms. They bruised under her touch, the petals soft and yielding, but she didn't flinch. The bruise would heal. The vine would bloom again. The cycle was simple and certain, and she was part of it now, whether she'd chosen to be or not. Her mother appeared in the doorway. Not running, not crying, just standing with a brass tumbler in her hand, as if she'd been waiting at exactly this spot since Chandrika left. The tumbler was warm, freshly polished, the metal gleaming in the dim light. Her mother said nothing. She simply held out the tumbler, and Chandrika took it, the heat seeping into her palms, the weight of it solid and real. She set the empty milk pail down inside the veranda. The dust motes in the amber light swirled around it, tiny particles rising and falling, the fragments of a memory she was finally ready to disturb. She closed her eyes and listened to the percolator's hiss, the sound drifting through the window, steady and sure. It was the same sound she'd heard in Singapore, but now it sounded like a lullaby, not a question. And for the first time in years, she let herself believe that the answer was enough. The final drip. The flame died with a soft sigh, the wick curling inward like a tightening question mark before vanishing into the brass cup's shallow pool of cooled oil. Indranil set the extinguished lamp on the counter beside the percolator, his fingers lingering on the cool metal for a heartbeat longer than necessary, as if testing whether the warmth of the day still radiated from within. Outside, the Agrahara lane lay bathed in a thin, silver starlight that pooled in the cracks of the old stone pavement. The distant temple bell marked the hour with a single, mournful toll, the vibration humming through the ground before dissolving into the humid air. He reached for the brass shutter, the metal heavy and familiar in his palm. He slid it closed, the groan of hinges sounding like an old man clearing his throat, then turned the key with slow, deliberate precision. The lock clicked, a sharp, final sound that echoed down the empty lane like a period at the end of a long, rambling sentence. A full stop to the day's quiet commerce. No more customers would come tonight. No more tumblers would be polished until they gleamed like small moons. No more kayapi poured with that specific, rhythmic flourish. The shop was done. Indranil stood in the cool dark, the shadows pressing against him like a heavy blanket, and listened to the percolator's final drip. One drop, landing with a hollow plink in the lower chamber. Then another, slower this time. Then silence, absolute and total. The street was empty, yet the silence was not lonely. It carried the day's gentle residue, the lingering, bittersweet scent of roasted coffee dust clinging to the rafters, the ghost of laughter from the evening crowd still vibrating in the walls, the residual warmth of brass tumblers cooling on the counter. Indranil let it settle over him like a well-worn shawl, the weight of it comforting rather than suffocating. He wondered, briefly, if this was what peace felt like, not the absence of noise, but the presence of memory. Across the lane, Sundararajan returned to his veranda, the wooden floorboards creaking a familiar greeting under his weight. He sat cross-legged, the fabric of his veshti pooling around him, and stroked his white beard with the slow, rhythmic cadence of a man who has seen many evenings come and go. His eyes, clouded by cataracts but sharp in their own way, scanned the darkened shop front. Content that the traditions continued, not in fanfare, but in silence, in ritual. In the next generation's quiet, unassuming hands, he closed his eyes. The night. Bloom's scent washed over him, its heavy, intoxicating perfume weaving through the bougainvillea, and he let out a breath that sounded like gratitude. Amara put her camera away for the final evening, sliding the lens cap on with a soft click that seemed to seal the day shut. She had spent the afternoon chasing the Agrahara's disappearing rituals, the gleam of brass tumblers, the tangled violence of the night bloom vines, the slow, hypnotic dance of coffee percolation. But now she chose to live in the quiet rather than capture it. The Lane story didn't need her lens to exist. It didn't need to be framed or focused or exposed. It existed in the space between the drip of the percolator and the sigh of the night wind, in the unphotographable texture of belonging. She placed the camera in its bag and zipped it shut, feeling lighter than she had all day. Hana tended her garden one final time, her movements slowed by the gathering dark. She arranged the stones in her Zen garden by touch alone, her fingers tracing the curves of each river-smooth pebble, feeling the coolness of the slate seep into her skin. The night bloom scent scented the air at dusk, its fragrance thick and cloying, bridging her solitary plot and the wider community with its quiet, relentless insistence. She touched the blossoms reverently, her movements slow and precise, counting the petals as if they were prayer beads. For the first time in years, the pull of departure was absent. The roots she had planted, both in the earth and in this strange, fragile community, held fast. Indranil turned from the shutter, the empty street stretching behind him like a forgotten thought. He walked to his small room above the shop, the narrow staircase groaning under his step. The ceiling fan clicked with each rotation, a metronome of domesticity. He counted the clicks, not because he was tired, but because the rhythm matched something he was finally ready to rest in. 3 clicks, a gap, 3 clicks, a silence. The pattern was familiar, ancient, and it pulled him down into sleep like a lullaby sung by a voice he couldn't quite place. He dreamed of Chandrika's father sitting at the counter, drinking kawapi from the 5th tumbler, the one reserved for Ramanathan Iyer, who had vanished from the routine in 2010, leaving a silence no one had dared to fill. The coffee was perfect, the froth still and white as milk, and the silence between them was full, brimming with things unsaid but perfectly understood. No words were needed. The steam rose in slow, lazy spirals, twisting into the dreamlight, and the brass tumbler gleamed with a soft inner radiance. He woke to the percolator's hiss. It was the same sound he'd heard for 30 years, a daily alarm that had once signaled urgency, but now it sounded like a lullaby, not a question. The hiss was steady, unhurried, the same sound Chandrika had heard in Singapore hotel lobbies and sterile airport cafes. But here in this room, it didn't sound like a question demanding an answer. It sounded like the answer itself. Indranil stood at the window and watched the Lane sleep. The rain trees shed leaves in slow, spiraling descents, rotating like tiny helicopters before settling on the damp earth. The night bloom scent bloomed at the gate, its white trumpets opening to the moon, and the dust settled in the amber glow of the single street lamp. Somewhere, a dog barked once, sharp and sudden, then fell silent, chastened by the weight of the night. The Lane was a living thing, breathing in the dark, expanding and contracting with a slow pulmonary rhythm, and he was part of it now, a cell in its slow-beating heart. He closed his eyes and listened to the final drip. It echoed like a period at the end of a long sentence, a grammatical certainty that brought the story to a close. The story ended not with a resolution, not with a climactic chord, but with a slow exhale, a fading into sleep. The percolator's hiss was the only sound, steady and sure, filling the room with its mundane holiness. For the first time in years, Indranil let himself believe that the answer was enough. The drip stopped, the silence held, and in that holding, everything remained exactly as it should be.